The dust hung in the air like a veil between earth and sky, turning the afternoon sun into a pale orange coin that offered light but little mercy. Jake Mackenzie had been riding for 3 days straight, his throat as dry as the cracked earth beneath his horse's hooves, his stomach tight with a hunger he'd learned to ignore years ago. The bay mare beneath him was tired too, her head hanging low as they followed the old cattle trail that wound through the scrubland of western Texas. He'd been heading toward El Paso with nothing but a worn saddle, $43 in his pocket, and a past he'd spent the better part of a decade trying to outrun. The well appeared first as a dark smudge on the horizon, then gradually took shape as a rough stone circle with a wooden frame and bucket. Jake felt relief flood through him at the sight. Water meant life out here, and both he and the mare desperately needed it. But as he drew closer, something made him pull back on the reins. 2 small figures sat huddled against the base of the well, and even from a distance, he could hear the sound that made his chest tighten. They were crying. Jake approached slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt revolver at his hip, not out of threat, but out of the caution that had kept him alive this long. The frontier was no place for carelessness, especially when something seemed out of place. As he got closer, he could see they were girls, both thin as fence rails, with tangled dark hair and dresses that had once been white, but were now stained with dirt and what looked like dried blood. The older one couldn't have been more than 8, and she had her arms wrapped protectively around the younger one, who appeared to be 5 or 6 at most. Their faces were streaked with tears and grime, their eyes hollow with a kind of exhaustion that no child should ever know. Jake dismounted slowly, making sure his movements were calm and unthreatening. The older girl's eyes snapped up to him, filled with fear and something else, something fiercer. She pulled her sister closer, her small jaw set in defiance even as her whole body trembled. Jake held up his hands, keeping his distance. The mare moved toward the well of her own accord, and he let her go, knowing she needed water more than he needed to maintain control right now. "Easy now," he said, his voice rough from disuse and dust. "I'm not here to hurt you. What are you girls doing out here all alone?" The older girl stared at him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face for some sign of whether he could be trusted. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. "Our mama and papa, they're gone." The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy with a grief too large for such a small person to carry. Jake felt his stomach drop. He'd seen enough death on the frontier to know what "gone" meant when it came from the mouth of a child sitting alone in the middle of nowhere. He crouched down, still keeping a respectful distance, and removed his hat. The sun beat down on his dark hair, but it seemed disrespectful to keep it on in the presence of such tragedy. "How long ago?" he asked gently. "Yesterday morning," the older girl said, her voice cracking. "Maybe the morning before. I don't know anymore. We've been walking since. We ran out of water this morning and Sarah, she can't walk anymore. She's so hungry she can't stop crying, and I don't know what to do." Her voice broke on the last word, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. The admission of helplessness seemed to cost her something vital, as if saying it out loud made it more terrifyingly real. The younger girl, Sarah, looked up at Jake with eyes that seemed far too large for her small face. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her skin flushed with what he suspected was the beginning of fever. Dehydration, exposure, hunger, the combination could kill a child in days, sometimes hours. He'd seen it happen before, and the memory of those other times made something cold and hard settle in his chest. Jake stood and walked to the well, drawing up the bucket with steady pulls on the rope. The water that came up was murky but wet, and that was all that mattered right now. He poured some into his canteen, then brought it to the girls. "Slow sips," he instructed the older girl. "Not too much at once or you'll get sick. Just enough to wet your mouths for now." The older girl took the canteen with shaking hands and held it to her sister's lips first. Sarah drank greedily, and the older girl had to pull it away despite the younger child's protests. "I know, Sarah, I know you're thirsty, but we have to be careful." Then she took a small sip herself, her throat working as she swallowed, her eyes closing briefly as if in prayer. Jake went back to his saddlebags and pulled out the last of his jerky and half a loaf of bread he'd bought in the last town. It wasn't much, but it was what he had. He broke the bread in half and handed it to the older girl along with a piece of jerky. "Eat this slow too. Your stomachs aren't used to food right now." "What's your name?" the girl said, already breaking the bread into smaller pieces for her sister. Emma and Sarah Hendricks. Our papa was bringing us to live with our aunt in Fort Stockton. He said our ranch wasn't safe anymore, that the drought and the raiders made it impossible to stay. We were traveling with a wagon train, but Papa got into an argument with the wagon master about the route. Papa said it was taking too long, that we should cut across to save time. The wagon master said it was too dangerous, but Papa, he was so stubborn. Her voice caught, and she had to stop for a moment to compose herself. Jake settled down onto the ground, his back against the sun-warmed stones of the well. He pulled out his tobacco pouch and rolled a cigarette, more for something to do with his hands than any real desire to smoke. What happened? Emma watched Sarah eat with a protective intensity before continuing. We left the wagon train 3 days ago. Papa said it would only take a day and a half to reach Fort Stockton if we went straight across. But we got lost. The landmarks Papa was looking for, they weren't where he remembered. Then the wheel broke on our wagon, the big one in the back. Papa tried to fix it, but we didn't have the right tools. Mama said we should walk back to find the wagon train, but Papa said we were too far now, that Fort Stockton had to be close. She paused, her small hands clenching into fists. Then the riders came. Jake felt his jaw tighten. He didn't need to ask what kind of riders. The frontier was full of men who'd lost their way, who'd decided that taking was easier than earning. Comancheros, outlaws, deserters from both armies during the war, men who'd seen so much violence that it had become the only language they spoke fluently. How many? 4, Emma said. They wanted our horses, our supplies, everything. Papa tried to reason with them. He offered them what little money we had, but they just laughed. Then Papa told Mama to run with us to hide in the rocks. We ran, and I heard the shooting. I wanted to go back, but Mama held us tight, her hand over Sarah's mouth to keep her quiet. We hid until it got dark and the riders left. When we came back, they were both lying by the wagon. Mama was still breathing a little, and she told us to walk toward the rising sun, that we'd find help. Then she stopped breathing, and I couldn't make her start again. The matter of fact way Emma told the story, as if recounting a trip to the general store, made it somehow worse. She'd had to become hard to survive, to push down the grief and fear so she could function, so she could keep her sister alive. Jake had done the same thing once, a long time ago, when he'd been not much older than Emma was now. He stubbed out his cigarette and stood, walking to the mare and running a hand along her dusty neck. The horse had been his companion for 4 years now, steady and reliable in a world where both qualities were rare. He'd been planning to sell her in El Paso, use the money to buy passage on a stage heading west, maybe California or Oregon, somewhere far enough away that his name didn't carry weight anymore. Somewhere he could start fresh, build something clean. But looking at these 2 girls, at the way Emma held her sister with a fierceness that spoke of love stronger than fear, at the way Sarah trusted her sister completely despite the terror that must be coursing through her small body, Jake felt something shift inside him. He thought about the man he'd been 10 years ago, before the war, before he'd made choices that still haunted his dreams. He thought about the promises he'd made to himself in the dark hours of the night, promises about being better, about redemption if such a thing was even possible for someone like him. Fort Stockton was 40 miles northeast, a hard ride even for a healthy adult. The girls wouldn't make it on foot, and riding double or triple would be slow, would tire the mare beyond recovery in this heat. But there was another option, one that would cost him everything he'd been working toward. The town of Redemption Springs was only 15 miles south. It was a place he'd sworn he'd never return to, a place where people knew his name, knew what he'd done. But it had a doctor, a church, people who might take in 2 orphaned girls. Jake made his decision with the same quiet certainty that had guided him through 100 life or death moments. He turned back to the girls and crouched down again. Listen to me, both of you. We're gonna ride to a town not far from here. It's called Redemption Springs. There's good people there who can help you, who can get you to your aunt in Fort Stockton. But we need to move now, before the heat gets worse. Can you ride? Emma nodded, but Sarah just stared at him with those enormous eyes, her face pale beneath the sunburn. Jake gently lifted Sarah, surprised by how light she was, how fragile. He settled her in the saddle, then helped Emma up behind her. Hold onto your sister tight, he instructed. Don't let go for any reason. He took the mare's reins and began walking, leading the horse south toward a town he'd thought he'd never see again. The journey took 4 hours, 4 hours of steady walking under a sun that showed no mercy. Jake's boots, already worn thin, began to give up their last bits of protection, and he could feel blisters forming on his heels and toes. His throat was parched again, the small amount of water he'd allowed himself at the well long since used up. But he kept walking, one foot in front of the other, because that was what you did. You kept moving forward because stopping meant giving up, and giving up meant death. Emma talked as they walked, maybe to distract herself and Sarah from their discomfort, maybe because she needed to process what had happened. She told him about their ranch, about the father who'd been stern but loving, who'd taught her to rope and ride despite her mother's protests that such things weren't ladylike. She told him about her mother, who'd made the best apple pie in 3 counties, who'd sung them to sleep every night with old songs from back east. She told him about Sarah's fear of thunder, about her own dreams of becoming a teacher one day, about the baby brother they'd lost to fever 2 winters ago. Jake listened, occasionally responding with a grunt or a word, but mostly just letting the girl talk. He understood what she was doing, creating a memorial with words, making sure someone remembered her parents as they'd truly been, not just as 2 more bodies left for the buzzards on the endless Texas plain. It was important work, this remembering, maybe the most important work there was. By the time Redemption Springs came into view, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The town looked much as Jake remembered it, a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a main street, with a church steeple rising above the rest like a finger pointing toward heaven. His heart began to pound as they got closer, and he felt the old fear creeping up his spine. These people had every right to hate him, to run him out of town or worse. But for the girls, he'd face it. He owed them that much. They entered the main street, just as people were beginning to emerge for the evening, drawn out by the cooling air. Jake saw the recognition dawn on faces as they passed, saw the way conversations stopped mid-sentence, the way hands moved toward weapons. He kept his head up, his gaze steady, leading the horse toward the doctor's office near the far end of town. A man stepped into the street ahead of them, and Jake's blood turned cold. Samuel Garrett, the town's blacksmith, a bear of a man with arms like tree trunks and a face carved from granite. Garrett's son had been Jake's best friend once, had ridden with him during the war. Had died because of a decision Jake had made, a decision that had seemed right at the time, but had led to an ambush that killed 6 men, including young Thomas Garrett. "Jake Mackenzie," Garrett said, his voice carrying down the street like thunder. "You got some nerve showing your face here." Jake stopped, his hand steady on the reins. "I'm not here for trouble, Sam. These girls need help. Their parents were killed by raiders 2 days ago. They need a doctor, food, and someone to get them to their aunt in Fort Stockton. After that, I'll leave. You have my word." Garrett's eyes moved to the girls, taking in their condition, the exhaustion and fear written plainly on their faces. Something in his expression shifted, the hard anger softening just slightly. A woman pushed through the small crowd that had gathered, and Jake recognized Martha Simmons, the doctor's wife. She took one look at Sarah and Emma, and her face transformed with concern. "Sweet merciful heavens," Martha said, rushing forward. "You poor darlings. Come. Let's get you down from there and into the doctor's office. Samuel, fetch my husband. Tell him it's urgent." She looked up at Jake, and her eyes held questions, but also a kind of grudging acknowledgement. "You did right bringing them here." The next hour passed in a blur. Dr. Simmons examined both girls, declaring them dehydrated and malnourished but otherwise unharmed. They were given water, real food, and clean clothes that Martha had rushed to gather from neighbors. Jake stayed in the background, watching from the doorway, ready to leave the moment he was no longer needed. But Emma kept looking for him, as if afraid he might disappear like everyone else in her life had disappeared. As the doctor finished his examination, Sheriff Tom Baker arrived, a tall man in his 50s with gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He listened as Emma told her story again, making notes in a small leather book. When she described the 4 riders, the sheriff's face grew grim. "Sounds like the Dalton gang. They've been terrorizing wagon trains and small homesteads for months. We've been trying to track them, but they always seem to be one step ahead." He looked at Jake. "We'll send word to Fort Stockton about the girl's aunt, see about getting them there safe." Jake nodded, preparing to slip out, but Emma suddenly grabbed his hand. "Don't go," she said, her voice small and frightened. "Please." Everyone else went away. He looked down at her, this brave little girl who'd kept her sister alive through sheer force of will, and felt something break open inside his chest. He knelt down so he was at her level. I have to, Emma. This town, these people, they have reason not to want me here. But you're safe now. These are good folks. They'll take care of you. What you did was wrong, Jake, Sheriff Baker said quietly. What happened to those boys during the war, that was on you. You made a bad call, and good men died. But you didn't run when you could have. You faced the consequences, served your time in that prisoner camp, and now you've done a good thing, bringing these girls to safety when you could have just kept riding. That counts for something. Samuel Garrett had been standing in the doorway, his massive frame blocking most of the light. Now he stepped forward and every muscle in Jake's body tensed, ready for violence. But Garrett didn't raise his fists. Instead, he extended his hand. My boy thought highly of you once. He wouldn't want me to hold on to this hate forever. You made a mistake, but you paid for it. And today, you did right by these children. That's enough for me. Jake stared at the offered hand, hardly daring to believe it. Slowly, he reached out and clasped it, feeling the strength in Garrett's grip, but also something else. Forgiveness, maybe, or at least the beginning of it. I'm sorry, Sam, he said, his voice thick. I'm sorry every day for what happened to Thomas. He was a better man than me. Maybe, Garrett said. Or maybe you just needed time to grow into the man you were supposed to be. Either way, you're here now and these girls need someone. He paused, then added, we could use another hand at the stable. It doesn't pay much, but it's honest work. If you're looking to stay, that is. Jake looked around the room at the faces watching him. Martha Simmons with her arms around both girls, Dr. Simmons cleaning his instruments with practiced efficiency, Sheriff Baker with his steady, assessing gaze, and Samuel Garrett with his offered hand still extended. He thought about El Paso, about running away to start fresh somewhere no one knew his name. But maybe redemption wasn't found in running. Maybe it was found in staying, in facing the mistakes of the past and trying to build something better in spite of them. I'd like that, Jake said finally. I'd like that very much. The next few days passed in a strange, suspended kind of peace. Jake took up residence in a small room above the stable, spending his days mucking stalls, shoeing horses, and doing the hard physical work that left him too tired to dream at night. Emma and Sarah stayed with Martha Simmons, who doted on them like the grandmother they'd never known. Word was sent to Fort Stockton about their aunt, and a reply came back within a week. The aunt was alive and well, eager to take in her brother's children, but snowed in by an early winter storm that had hit the northern territories. It would be at least a month before travel was safe. In that time, something unexpected happened. The town, which had been ready to run Jake out on a rail just days before, began to soften toward him. They saw how he worked. Never complaining, always the first to arrive and the last to leave. They saw how gently he treated the horses, how patiently he taught Emma to curry the mare when she came to visit, how he whittled a small wooden doll for Sarah that made the little girl smile for the first time since her parents' death. They saw a man trying to be better, and in a place called Redemption Springs, that meant something. Sheriff Baker tracked down the Dalton gang 3 weeks after Jake's arrival, capturing them after a brief gunfight that left 2 of the outlaws dead and the other 2 wounded. When he returned to town, he made a point of telling Emma and Sarah that justice had been served, that the men who'd killed their parents would hang. Emma cried when she heard the news, but not with joy. Just a quiet, exhausted grief for everything that had been lost, everything that could never be brought back. The day finally came when the roads cleared and Emma and Sarah's aunt sent word that she was coming to collect them. Jake helped Martha pack their things, his movements mechanical, his face carefully neutral. He'd known this day was coming, had prepared himself for it, but somehow it still hurt more than he'd expected. In such a short time, these girls had worked their way into his heart, had shown him that maybe he wasn't beyond redemption after all. Emma found him in the stable the night before her aunt was due to arrive. She climbed up into the hayloft where he sometimes sat, watching the sunset through the open door. She sat beside him without speaking for a long time, just watching the sky turn from blue to gold to purple. Finally, she said, "I don't want to leave. Your aunt loves you," Jake said gently. "She's family. She'll give you and Sarah a good home, a real home with a roof that doesn't leak in regular meals. That's what your parents wanted for you." "I know," Emma said. "But you feel like family too. You saved us. You could have just kept riding, but you didn't. You gave up whatever you were running toward just to help us." Why? Jake considered the question. trying to find words for something he didn't fully understand himself. "I guess," he said slowly, "because I needed to. Because for a long time I've been trying to figure out if a man can change, if the things he's done wrong can ever be balanced out by doing right. When I saw you two at that well, I saw a chance to find out. Maybe I'm still finding out." "Do you think people can change?" Emma asked. "I think people can try," Jake said. "And maybe the trying is what matters most. Maybe that's what redemption really is, not erasing the past but refusing to let it write your future." Emma leaned against him, and he put an arm around her small shoulders, feeling the weight of her trust like a precious, fragile thing. They sat that way until the stars came out, two people who'd both lost everything finding a moment of peace in each other's company. The aunt arrived the next morning in a sturdy wagon driven by a ranch hand from Fort Stockton. She was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and her brother's strong jaw. She swept both girls into her arms, crying and laughing at once, overwhelmed with relief that they were alive. Jake stood back, watching the reunion, feeling both happy and hollow. Martha Simmons pressed packages of food into the aunt's hands for the journey, and Dr. Simmons checked the girls one last time, pronouncing them fit to travel. As the aunt prepared to leave, Emma broke away and ran to Jake. She threw her arms around his waist, holding tight. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for stopping. Thank you for not riding past us." Jake knelt down and looked into her eyes, these eyes that had seen too much but still held hope. "You're going to be okay, Emma. You and Sarah both. You're strong, stronger than you know. You'll do good things with your life. I'm sure of it. Will you ever come visit us?" Emma asked. "Maybe someday," Jake said, though they both knew it probably wasn't true. "But even if I don't, I'll always remember you. I'll remember the girl who was brave enough to keep her sister alive, brave enough to trust a stranger. You taught me something important, Emma. You reminded me why it matters to keep trying, to keep choosing right even when it's hard." Emma nodded, tears streaming down her face, then turned and climbed into the wagon. Sarah waved from her aunt's lap, clutching the wooden doll Jake had made, and then they were gone, the wagon rolling north toward Fort Stockton and whatever future awaited them there. Jake stood in the street long after the wagon had disappeared from view, feeling the weight of the goodbye settle on his shoulders. Samuel Garrett came up beside him, his presence solid and comforting. "You did good," the blacksmith said. "Not every man gets a chance at redemption. Fewer still have the courage to take it." "I don't feel redeemed," Jake admitted. "I still think about the men who died because of me. I still carry that weight." "Maybe you always will," Garrett said. "Maybe that's part of your redemption, carrying that weight and choosing to do good anyway." My Thomas, he believed a man was defined not by his worst moment but by what he did after. I think maybe he was right. Jake turned and walked back toward the stable, his boots crunching on the packed earth. The mare whinnied when she saw him, and he ran a hand along her neck, feeling the warmth of her, the simple reality of her presence. He had work to do, horses to tend, a life to build. It wasn't the life he'd planned, wasn't the fresh start in a place where no one knew his name. But maybe it was better. Maybe facing your past was braver than running from it. Maybe redemption wasn't found in forgetting, but in remembering and choosing to be better anyway. That night, Jake sat on the steps of the stable, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. He thought about two little girls sitting by a well, crying from hunger and fear and loss. He thought about the decision he'd made to stop, to help, to give up his plans for theirs. And he realized that in saving them, he'd begun to save himself. Not completely, maybe not ever completely, but enough. Enough to sleep without whiskey dulling the dreams. Enough to face each day with something approaching hope. The frontier was a hard place, unforgiving and cruel to those who faltered. But it was also a place where a man could remake himself, could write a new story over the ashes of the old. Jake Mackenzie wasn't the same man who'd made that fatal mistake during the war. He wasn't the same man who'd ridden toward El Paso with nothing but guilt and a desire to disappear. He was becoming someone new, someone better, someone who'd chosen compassion over convenience, who'd chosen to stop when others might have ridden past. In a small town called Redemption Springs, a man was learning that the name of a place could become prophecy if you were brave enough to believe in it. And somewhere on the road to Fort Stockton, two little girls carried with them the memory of a cowboy who'd stopped his horse when they needed him most, proof that even in the hardest places, kindness could still take root and grow. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human suffering and human grace alike. But Jake watched them with something he hadn't felt in years: peace. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of acceptance, of knowing that while he couldn't change his past, he could choose his future, and he'd chosen to stay, to build, to try. In the end, maybe that was all redemption really was: the simple courage to stop running and start living, one honest day at a time. Winter came to Redemption Springs with a gentleness that surprised Jake. He'd spent so many winters on the move, sleeping rough, fighting the cold with nothing but a thin blanket and the warmth of campfires that never quite chased away the chill in his bones. But now he had a roof, walls, a small stove that kept the worst of the cold at bay. He had work that filled his days and left him tired in a good way, the kind of tired that came from honest labor rather than running. The townspeople continued to warm to him, slowly at first, then with increasing acceptance. Mrs. Henderson at the general store stopped watching him suspiciously when he came in for supplies. The Reverend invited him to Sunday services, and though Jake declined at first, uncomfortable with the idea of sitting in a church after everything he'd done, he eventually found himself there, listening to sermons about forgiveness and grace. The words didn't always sink in, but the act of sitting there, of being part of something larger than himself, brought a comfort he hadn't expected. Samuel Garrett became something close to a friend. They worked together in companionable silence most days, but sometimes the big man would share stories about his son, about Thomas as a boy who'd loved horses and had dreams of starting his own ranch someday. Jake listened, letting Garrett talk, understanding that this was part of the healing for both of them. The father needed to remember his son not just as a casualty of war, but as a person who'd lived and laughed and hoped. And Jake needed to hear it, to understand the full weight of what had been lost because of his mistake. Christmas approached, and Jake found himself invited to dinner at the Simmons house. He almost declined, feeling unworthy of such kindness, but Martha had insisted with a warmth that brooked no argument. The evening was filled with simple pleasures, good food, warm conversation, laughter that felt almost foreign to him after so many years of solitude. As he walked back to the stable that night, his stomach full and his heart strangely light, he realized something profound. He was building a life here, a real life, the kind he'd thought was forever beyond his reach. A letter arrived in January, forwarded from Fort Stockton. Jake's hands trembled slightly as he opened it, recognizing Emma's careful handwriting. She wrote about their new home, about their aunt's kindness, about Sarah starting to smile more often. She wrote about the school she was attending, about her teacher who encouraged her dreams of becoming a teacher herself one day. And at the end, in words that made Jake's eyes sting with unexpected tears, she wrote, "You told me that people can try to be better, and that the trying is what matters. I wanted you to know that you succeeded. You didn't just try. You saved us. And I hope you know that you're a good man, no matter what happened before. Thank you for stopping your horse that day. Thank you for seeing us when you could have looked away." Jake folded the letter carefully and placed it in the small wooden box where he kept his few precious possessions. That night, he sat at the small table in his room and wrote back, his letters clumsy and unpracticed but sincere. He told Emma about his life in Redemption Springs, about the work he was doing, about the people who'd given him a second chance. He told her that her words meant more to him than she could possibly know, that she'd given him a gift far greater than any he'd given her. He told her to keep dreaming, to become that teacher she wanted to be, to live a life worthy of the parents who'd loved her enough to die trying to protect her. Spring came with a burst of wildflowers that turned the harsh Texas landscape into something almost beautiful. Jake found himself noticing things he'd ignored for years. The way the light changed throughout the day, the sound of children laughing as they played in the street, the simple pleasure of a good meal shared with friends. He was changing, he realized, becoming someone he barely recognized. The hard edges that had defined him for so long were softening, worn smooth by daily acts of kindness, by the simple rhythm of honest work and genuine connection. One evening, as Jake was closing up the stable, Sheriff Baker stopped by. The lawman had a thoughtful expression on his face, and he leaned against the fence, watching as Jake finished his work. "Got something I want to talk to you about," Baker said finally. "The town council's been discussing hiring a deputy. Nothing fancy, just someone to help keep the peace. Make the rounds at night, that sort of thing. I recommended you." Jake stopped mid-motion, surprise flooding through him. "Me? Tom? I'm the last person who should be wearing a badge. You know what I did. I know what you did 10 years ago, Baker said. I also know what you've been doing for the past 6 months. I know you're reliable, honest, good in a crisis. I know you understand the cost of violence, which makes you less likely to resort to it unnecessarily. And I know the people of this town have come to trust you. That's worth more than a clean record. Jake set down the brush he'd been using and walked over to the fence. I don't know if I can do that, Tom. I don't know if I deserve that kind of responsibility. Maybe you don't, Baker said bluntly. But then again, maybe that's exactly why you should take it. A man who thinks he deserves power is dangerous. A man who understands the weight of it, who's reluctant to take it on, that's the kind of man we need. He paused, then added, think about it. You don't have to decide tonight, but I believe in you, Jake. This town believes in you. Maybe it's time you started believing in yourself. Jake thought about the offer for days, turning it over in his mind like a stone in his pocket. The idea of being responsible for the safety of others, of wearing a badge after everything he'd done, seemed almost absurd. But he also understood what Baker had been trying to tell him. Redemption wasn't a destination you reached and then stopped. It was a journey that continued, one choice at a time, one day at a time, and maybe accepting this responsibility despite his doubts and fears was the next step on that journey. He gave Baker his answer a week later, standing in the sheriff's office with his hat in his hands. I'll do it, he said simply. But I need you to promise me something, if I ever step out of line. If I ever abuse this position or fail to live up to what it requires, you'll take this badge back without hesitation. Baker smiled and handed him the deputy's star. You have my word. Welcome aboard, Jake. Wearing the badge felt strange at first, like putting on someone else's clothes, but Jake grew into it. Just as he'd grown into his new life in Redemption Springs. He made his rounds each night, checking doors, keeping an eye out for trouble, stopping to chat with the few people still out after dark. He broke up fights at the saloon with a calm authority that surprised everyone, including himself. He helped old Mrs. Peterson when her cow got loose, spent an afternoon teaching some of the town boys how to properly care for a horse, and once talked down a drunk cowboy who was waving a gun around, managing to resolve the situation without a single shot fired. The people of Redemption Springs began to see him not as Jake Mackenzie, the man with a dark past, but as Deputy Mackenzie, the steady presence who kept them safe. Children waved to him on the street, women smiled and nodded, men shook his hand and called him friend. It was a transformation so complete, so unexpected, that sometimes Jake had to stop and remind himself that this was real, that this was his life now. Another letter came from Emma in the summer, and this one included a drawing Sarah had made. It showed 3 figures, a man on a horse and 2 little girls by a well, rendered in the simple, honest style of a child. At the bottom, in Sarah's careful printing, were the words, "The cowboy who saved us." Jake pinned the drawing to the wall of his room, where he could see it every morning when he woke up. It served as a reminder of why he'd stopped running, of what could happen when you chose to help instead of turning away. Years passed, measured in the changing of seasons, in the growth of the town, in the deepening of relationships and the healing of old wounds. Jake became a fixture in Redemption Springs, as much a part of the town as the church steeple or the old well in the center of the square. He never married, though there were a few women who showed interest. He kept to himself mostly, content with his work, his friends, the life he'd built from the ashes of his past. Samuel Garrett passed away peacefully in his sleep one winter night,